Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I hope nobody had to travel too far. That was my joke. Um, and we're excited to share some of our theories, ideas, and experiences with regarding student voice in the composition classroom. In this presentation, the four of us, that's Karen, Eric, Sandra, and myself, will present on different aspects of the pedagogy of care. During the presentations, please mute your microphones and use the chat function to pose any questions or comments, and we'll spend the last 10 minutes addressing some of these questions. My name is Ruth Amon, and I'm an instructor of English at Hudson County Community College. My particular area of interest is in student voice in the classroom, and as such, I'm going to talk about student voice in the context of the democratic classroom. For a long time, like many of you, I'm sure, I've been quite aware of the pedagogical reasons why student voice seems to work in the classroom. But today I wanted to take a step back and examine why specifically the democratic classroom as an overarching theory can help us to understand the need for student voice in the classroom. The democratic classroom is a space whereby the principles of democracy are given a chance to be played out. I would like to present the idea that two of the major principles of democracy, according to Dana Bennis, are that of participation and empowerment. These values of empowerment and participation are central to the theories about the role of education in the lives of those we serve. In a democracy, the intention has to be that there are opportunities for participation by all citizens of that country. In a classroom, the educator has a responsibility to provide spaces for a variety of types of participation for the citizens of her class, in order that the citizens of that class might be able to contribute to the course. Just as a democracy, ideally, empowers its citizens to know that their wishes are to be taken into consideration, in the classroom, students must be empowered to know that their input will also be taken seriously. The theories of the democratic classroom certainly go hand in hand with sociocultural theory, of whom Vygotsky is probably the most known theorist. In brief, sociocultural theory posits that we learn from one another, and it is through these interactions with one another that our learning is both meaningful and possible. These experiences of being an active participant in a class will encourage our students to be invested in the outcomes of the course above and beyond the letter grade that they might receive. There are a variety of people who have theorized about democratic education. This slide shows just a small selection of these people, and I'm certainly not going to talk about all of them. I realize that I'm slipping between democratic education and of the democratic classroom. And while democratic education can perhaps be viewed as the umbrella, the democratic classroom, at least in my definition, is more closely connected to classroom pedagogy. We can go back as far as Matthew Arnold in the 1800s and John Dewey in the 1900s, who both explored the connections between education and democracy. While more recently, Basu has specifically focused on science education and democratic pedagogy. And just as an aside, I always find it so interesting the ways in which many progressive ideas explored over a century ago still sound so groundbreaking and often seem to be underexplored even today. So, while many of us are probably enthusiastic proponents of democracy, at least in the political sense, the idea of a democratic classroom may be somewhat less tempting. The idea of sharing that power might not be very appealing. But if we look beyond our fears of relinquishing our crowns, the democratic classroom is very much a necessity. If, as educators, we are striving for more than just wanting to make our students master the thesis statement, although I know and acknowledge that in and of itself is no mean feat, but if we do want more for our students, that is, if we believe in social justice or in the belief that our students who may have been marginalized by society due to race, class, religion, or sexual orientation, then surely we would want our classrooms to be places where student empowerment and participation are integral to the experience of our classes. To further labor this point, a democratic society requires its citizens to be active critical thinkers who have the ability to solve problems and have a strong sense of justice. and this must be something we strive for in our own classrooms. In fact, some studies have found that the advantages of democratic education is that it does challenge conventional thinking and produces independent, analytical, reflective, and questioning citizens. It has also been argued that democratic values are learnt through exposure to them, and as such, we must attempt to expose our students to these values. So, what might this look like in a composition classroom? It seems to me that in the composition classroom, these democratic ideals can be found through giving students choices about the types of assignments that they might be doing. If we want our students to be engaged in meaningful work, we cannot assume that all students will find the same types of reading and writing meaningful. Also, if we want participation in our classes, we should be offering students multiple ways in which they might participate. We can talk about this at the end. What this might mean in our own classrooms is providing and affirming these different types of participation. While we might hope that students would employ democratic discourse when given spaces, we certainly have to work hard as educators in order to instill these principles of democratic participation, thereby ensuring that we are not recreating spaces of exclusion and repression. This means that we should be establishing norms where equity, acceptance, and opportunity to speak are actively encouraged. This requires the instructor to continually reflect upon the ways in which the voices of the classroom are shared. Furthermore, as instructors, we want to be aware of the voices we choose to include from outside of the classroom, and how these voices may or may not be helpful in encouraging a democratic space. It also seems significant that the instructors should also carefully consider how their own voice may be used to help to promote a democratic classroom. This presentation is in no way an exhaustive piece on the democratic classroom, but intends to encourage us all to reflect on our own practice and the ways in which we share our classroom with our students. Thank you for listening, and here's a list of resources and references that have helped to inform this presentation. I'm going to transition now from this idea of the democratic classroom to Sandra, who's going to share with us a pedagogy of care within her own composition classes and how she specifically incorporates these into her own composition classroom.
All right, let's see. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Sandra Wozniak. I am an English instructor with the SEEK program at Queen's College. I would like to discuss two important concepts today. One being mentors and guides in our students' education journeys, and building a classroom community that is safe, welcoming, and structured. As we all know, for our students to be successful academically and to thrive in their college experiences, it is important that we set a foundation for success in a classroom environment that validates their experiences and acknowledges and honors their cultural backgrounds and learning styles. This requires that we act with empathy and responsibility, recognizing that educating others should always be an act of love. It also requires that we, as Paulo Freire reminds us, are critically attentive to the fears, resistance, and skepticism that students from subordinate groups bring with them to the school setting. This is particularly relevant now as we get ready to welcome in our classrooms, whether remotely or face-to-face, students who have faced immense loss and grief brought about by a pandemic that has exposed and exacerbated the inequalities of our education system. On March 11, 2020, my students and I went home knowing that we would probably not return to campus. The sense of normalcy, predictability, and routine that is built into an educational experience was disrupted, and they were abruptly facing unpredictability and uncertainty. However, for us as educators, it was a moment to act, to re-examine our practices, and to learn to reinvent ourselves so we could support our students through the catastrophic reality that was forced upon us all. What we have done to support our community and our students to complete their semester in our present circumstances represents the love, commitment, and dedication we have for the young people we are educating and serving. Most of us students have made it to college in spite of enormous difficulties that they are there because they want to be there. Some of them may say that their parents made them go to college or that they just want a diploma. but deep down they know that they are in college because they want transcendence through self-actualization. This reality is even more poignant now under our present circumstances. Now more than ever, it is important that we set up a classroom environment that values different learning styles, encourages camaraderie and collaboration, and provides students with routine and structure. So I'm going to talk about three important points that I have learned through teaching and with my students in the classroom. The first one that I think is very important for all of us is to get to know our students and their abilities. One of the first things that I think most of us do in our classrooms are introductions. And they are, I find that many students and even instructors find them to be frightening and awkward and maybe even dreadful, but they don't have to be that way. Introductions provide an opportunity to humanize ourselves in front of our students and to see them from a different perspective, how they act in front of others, what they say about themselves. It provides us another view of our students besides their writing and their personalities as students. So I recently completed a course in online teaching, and we learned to create videos to Flipgrid. I hope you guys have the opportunity to use it, where students will give students an opportunity to present themselves and to talk about themselves. And this gives us an idea of what students want to show about themselves in the presence of others. I think these videos will give me a different perspective on how my students are because we act different when we are asked to perform in front of a camera. The second point there is writing narratives. Personal narratives are important not only because of what we can learn about our students' writing abilities, but also because students tend to open up about themselves and their lives through their narratives. In her book, Relocating the Personal, Barbara Kamler writes that student writing about the self is valued because it affirms the student's own language and experience. In addition, narratives help us obtain a more holistic view of our students. The third point is paying attention to what they are capable of as writers, what they do well. In an essay, you may usually find a paragraph that has a better structure than the rest. Usually when I work with students in conferences, I read their essays before the conference, and I find a paragraph that was stronger than the rest and use that as a guide for them to fix and correct mistakes in other paragraphs. Encourage different genres of writing. This can help students become aware that the same creative process that goes into writing a song or a poem can be applied to writing an essay or a research paper. Furthermore, creative pieces students write can lead to explorations of topics for research. For example, in my class, a student wrote a narrative about the first time she met her great-grandmother when she was a little girl in China. She described in detail how frightening it was for her when she entered her grandmother's room when her foot bandages were being changed, revealing her bound feet. This narrative led her to investigate the practice of Chinese foot binding and how it affected the last generation of women whose feet were modified this way. Another example from one of my students is one of my students wrote a poem about how much he hated writing. This led him to a research project that explored college writers' attitudes towards writing. The second point, establish open communication and promote community building. Being clear about the ways in which we can make ourselves available to our students is very important. Is it going to be primarily via email in our office? I don't know what your situation will be in the fall, but for instance, for me, it will be online. I'm going to be teaching all my classes online. So meetings through online platforms are very useful, but I think it's important to give students consistency. This is how I'm going to meet with you. This is how I'm going to answer your questions. This is how I'm going to do it. The second is providing different times to accommodate students. Providing different alternatives to communicate with students. It is important that from the beginning of the semester we know our students' schedules. Some students work and are unable to meet us during regular office hours. So being open and knowing what their schedules are like allows us to accommodate times and look at our own schedules and see when we can meet them. and face-to-face contact is, I think, crucial. Building community, developing friendships, and creating networks is a fundamental part of the college experience for our students, psychologically, academically, and professionally. Usually in my classroom, I build study groups and study groups, writing groups, and performance groups. So students work together throughout the semester in giving feedback to each other, in giving feedback to each other's writing, working together in studying, and bringing their writing to final performance at the end of the semester. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this online. But I think the possibilities of the different online platforms that are being offered to us are endless. So also, I have learned from students themselves. They connect and collaborate in many different ways, in ways that I myself want to learn from them. They collaborate through Facebook, text, Google Classroom, and other online platforms and social media platforms. Right. The third point, and I think this is very, very important, establish a routine and encourage students to build habits. It is imperative to encourage students to cultivate habits. A lot of my students have expressed feeling lost without the guidance and support they had in high school from parents, teachers, and counselors. Now, as adults, they see themselves all of a sudden facing a tremendous amount of responsibility, balance their new sense of independence, hard academic work, and personal lives that may include working and helping at home. For this reason, it's important for them to have predictability and routine. In her book, The Creative Habit, Professor and choreographer argues that creativity is not simply the result of inspiration, but a quality that can be cultivated and augmented through routine and habit, and developed through exercise, through repetition, through a blend of learning and reflection that's both painstaking and rewarding. Everyone who has gone through the writing process knows this to be true. So, how can we help our students set goals and cultivate habits? Create a schedule and establish a routine. Encourage students to use a planner and a to-do list. And the third point, be vulnerable. Show students your own writing process and the routines and habits that have made you overcome obstacles in that process. I will go more into detail about this, but my time is running out. So I just want to say that it is important for students to know that they are not alone in their writing struggles and that they are part of a learning community that supports them and where their voices can be heard and celebrated. Our next presenter, Eric, is going to elaborate further on the idea of inviting and welcoming students' voices into the writing classroom.
Thank you. Share my screen here. Okay. So when we're thinking about incorporating, actually, I'm going to unshare for just a second while I do this first part. When we're thinking about incorporating the student voice into the classroom, I think it's really, really easy to get caught on this idea that just simply having a group discussion in class or asking for your students' commentary on reading is doing enough to bring their voices into the classroom. But more often than not, this tends to lead students to just look for the correct answer to the question that you're asking, rather than really delving into what they think about a topic. I also don't think that it's enough to try to just relate to the students with your topic, right? That you pick something that's more contemporary or that you think this age group of students would be more interested in, but really to have them develop their own thoughts, systems, figuring out their kind of answers and thoughts through their own process rather than us trying to lead them down a certain kind of path. My assertions for this presentation started from an article by Laura Julier, which was published in 2003, about creative writing in the composition classroom. And she really tries to reconcile one major point, which is that a common question she receives in her classroom is, can I use I in my essay, right? Can I write about myself? And despite the fact that probably in high school, maybe other composition classes, they've been told, don't use I, right? The essay cannot be about you. the readings that we give them when we're working on stuff in class, we're constantly asking for their own thoughts. So how can I not be a part of this? So I'm going to share with you just one sort of assignment process, an essay assignment that I go through with my students, hopefully that can help give a kind of framework for how you might incorporate some creative writing aspects into your own assignments. And now I'll go ahead and share this presentation. Okay. So I'm going to go kind of fast. I have several slides here. I won't read all the text on them. But the first step is really the most important step in this process, which is choosing a topic. It's really important that you pick a topic that doesn't have a kind of binary solution. So you're not picking a yes or no question or questions that typically have two opposing points of view. So a common a way that I see this is if students write about a topic like abortion, even though for many people abortion might be a topic that is nuanced and complex and has all these different aspects to it, probably your students will see it as binary, right? It's either good or bad, and therefore you have to pick one of those sides and answer with these kind of common points. So the topic example that I'm using for this presentation and I use in my class is, what do we do when the art we love is created by a monster, right? So we're thinking about musicians, you watch a movie, there's an actor you like, and you find out that that's a terrible person. Well, what do you do next, okay? The second step is to create context, right? You do need to give your students some kind of vocabulary or methodology to talk about the subject that you're bringing up, especially if it's something that they're not used to talking about, right? So you can read an article or have the students do an activity that gives them some vocabulary to answer those questions. In my class, we read an article that has the same title as the question we're asking. What do we do when the art we love is created by a monster, by Constance Grady. What's great about this article and why it's a good example article is that she really gives these kind of three philosophical frameworks for the students to think about this question, right? And to break those down, she essentially says, well, we can either not care that the artist that we love is a monster and just keep enjoying their work, right? We can care about it and acknowledge it, but still separate their work from who they are. Or we can acknowledge that who the artist is integral to the work that they're creating, and we have to think about both together, right? So she gives us those options. And then this is the first sort of creative writing activity, is to bring in the student's experience. So in this situation, I have my students spend a lot of time writing about, right, an artist that they like and trying to figure out why they like that artist. So for example, this past semester, I had a student who was very, very interested in Drake, the rapper Drake. So we spent a lot of time thinking about why is it that you feel like Drake has such an influence on your life? It's important that this assignment is not a quick assignment. Like you're not just doing 10 minutes of writing with the students where they're just thinking about it briefly, but that you're having a longer experience, maybe even a whole class where you're asking them to not think about the academic side of this paper, but the personal side, right? What does this mean to them, okay? Step 4, then you go back and relate the experience to the context, right? So if we go back to our article that gave us these frameworks and vocabulary for understanding, then you take this creative writing experience that you've had where they're just writing about why they like it, and you go back and say, okay, so let's try to understand this in vocabulary, right? If you find out that Drake is a terrible person, right, you said you would stop listening to his music, okay? So this is, how does that fit into the vocabulary that we have? Step 5, expanding student thinking. So this is where you give the students options that are not contained in the contextual assignment, right? To show that even though we have this essay that we're sort of basing our framework on, that there's other ways to think about solutions to this problem. So in my case, right, I often tell my students, okay, but have you thought about the fact that if you give up this artist's work, it provides you with a new opportunity to explore different kinds of art? Right? Have you thought about listening to people who aren't on the radio, who you didn't hear from your friends, right? Finding art on your own, right? Have you ever thought of just going to a museum and looking at art and seeing if you find a piece you like, right? Not having a tour guide tell you, not having a teacher tell you, just looking at it. And this often opens their eyes, right? They're like, oh, I guess I never thought about the fact that I can just go find new music, right? From a different artist, that there's lots of people making music. Okay. And then step 6, you go back to creative writing. So in this case, there's a lot of different options for things that you can do. Sandra mentioned in her presentation, right, having students who wrote poems or who wrote about their experiences doing, with a student seeing her grandmother in China, and that this shows us that there's all these different ways to do this. For me, I have my students write a short story, right, in which they try to explain the world if their favorite artist or this artist who's had influence on them didn't exist. This is an interesting assignment, and it brings a lot to the surface because some students realize nothing would change, right? The world wouldn't be very different if this person didn't exist, right? But some students think, well, if I hadn't heard this song and it didn't help me get through this difficult time in high school, maybe I would be a different person. Maybe I wouldn't have made it through these circumstances because I didn't have this thing to hold on to. So then they can start to really realize, is there an actual impact from the music and art they're thinking about, or is there sort of no solution, right? Is there no difference? It didn't really have an impact. Okay. And then step 7, the transition into the essay. So this is the sort of academic work and helping your students figure out, okay, how do I take this subject that I've been writing about and creative writing about in a short story and turning it into an essay? This is also a really, really important step in this process because it's reversing the idea that there's this category of things that are academic, right? And it's showing that the things the students care about, their own feelings, their own thoughts, everything they've developed during the process of this assignment can be made into something academic, right? That there's not some limit on the kinds of subjects and thoughts that can be brought into the classroom. And the things that are important to them matter in this space that we're occupying as well. Okay. And then after they've written the essay, which the rest of this is sort of the academic process and getting the essay out, right? It's always good to have them reflect. So I ask questions for my students to reflect about what they've learned in the essays and their enjoyment of the process. It's very rare that I get students who say they just flat out didn't enjoy the process. But I do get students who write things like they struggled with the process, or the reason they didn't enjoy it is because they really had to think for themselves through this process, right? Rather than saying, I feel like there's a correct answer and I'm pursuing that correct answer, right? So this is sort of the result of that ultimately in the assignment, that you hope that the students will see that it wasn't you sort of telling them, okay, there's two sides to this issue, or here's how we're going to go about this, but rather exploration first of your own thoughts and then finding a way to turn that into something academic. Okay, okay, so that's all I have. Next will be Karen Galley, who's also going to look at some practical assignments that she does in her classrooms, focusing on autoethnography.
Hi, everyone. Hi. Let me just get my screen up. All right, so I'm Karen Galley. I'm also an instructor at Hudson County Community College. And my interests are in bicultural identity and representation in a composition classroom. So my pedagogy stems from oral histories and the tradition of giving voice to cultures, traditions, and practices. In the modern context, the oral histories that we once carried, they're now told through technology, right? So in my composition course, I have a thread of digital literacy. We use technology as the vehicle to tell our stories, hence we create our digital stories. I draw on this idea in pedagogy that students who have at one point, perhaps in their academic lives, were told that their cultural background, their cultural practices, whether it be language or an accent or the way they dress, that they were all liabilities, when in fact their cultural practices are assets. And the researcher that I sort of default to is Marina Nunes, who talks a lot about liability versus assets of cultural practices. So anyhow, back to the landscape for my presentation. So my students create a video. They do a digital storytelling project about autoethnography, or their autobiography. Okay, so that's the setup. So I mentioned Marina Nunes. She is just an amazing researcher talking about otherness in the classroom. And she go of assumptions about our students, validating their experiences, accepting the ways that they express themselves, and how we as educators in the classroom, how we can be role models for them. And this is stuff that Ruth and Sandra and Eric, you guys all touched on too. So after being introduced to Nunes, I asked this question: how can I find the centrifugal force for my students to be their authentic selves, to create assignments where they actually learn about writing, but they feel that they have represented themselves? So autoethnography, right? I broke it down into these 4 buckets, right? And the first one is looking inward, self-reflection and exploration, looking outward, the social reflection, and then exploration, where this is the bulk of where their composition happens in low stake and high stake assignments. The end result is the production of a 3 to 5 minute video, and they have written components that are also required, all the essays that we create along the way, but also a process paper of just this whole project. Our project takes up about 5 weeks of our semester. And of course, you know, all the activities and assignments are scaffolded in that 5 weeks. I would be remiss if I didn't at least have one slide about the elements of digital storytelling. These are the 8 components that make up a great digital story, and we work with these components to ensure that we're not just writing a narrative that now has a visual, right? We have to think about all of these 8 components. So how does it translate into student composition? Oh, sorry. How does it translate into student writing? So, you know, word choice, cultural terminology is diction, audience, definition. We do descriptions, purpose in writing, and anecdotal personal experiences. There's even a small portion of research, since we are framing this as an autoethnography. How do we relate to the social and political and cultural practices and meanings in society? So there's a little bit of research there as well. I have 2 student projects. I think I'm only going to share the first one, but here's a little bit of background on the project. Students were permitted to use any non-original visual work, but they had to write their own. They had to do their writing had to be original work. So this was created by a young man in my Comp 1 class who never spoke in class, and when he did speak, he struggled with use of language. And I'm so proud of this assignment. He talked about growing up in an underfunded area of Jersey City, which is where our college is located, and he talked about gentrification. So I'm just going to play like about 40 seconds of it.
Breaking news, breaking news. Chaos had corrupted in our fellow community. Please be alert. Please be alert. Day by day, hour by hour, minute by minute, our low-income families are becoming in danger, being flushed out their homes, being brought out and pushed them to the streets, pushed them into shelters, pushed them away to the violence. Instead of just helping each other, we all bleed the same blood. We have those that look down on low-income families like they are not good enough. As you can see, all this is gated communities. We all live together.
So it's just a really small clip, but there was so much fluency in his project that was buried in our regular in-person class. I mean, he was always in class, always wanted to do the work, but he had a hard time making a bridge, over that gap. So in our project, in this digital storytelling project, students were able to implement various traditional composition modalities like narration, definition, description, comparative analysis. It's all embedded in this digital story that they each created. So the reflections from this assignment, as the instructor, it really required calculation and just making sure that all of the scaffolded assignments and activities were in place and were just that I scaffolded everything correctly and timely. Also, because we're talking about holistic pedagogy, my students were quite reserved at first in sharing their cultural practices. And I suspect it's probably because so many of them have had adverse reactions to, speaking with an accent or using terminology from their native language. So that was something that I sort of wasn't prepared for the first time I taught it. Students also had these very baked in ideas about the stories that they wanted to tell about their own lives. So there was this great need to build the trust, in our class from me, that being vulnerable and telling their story was going to be okay, that it was going to be safe. They also had a little bit of resistance, or maybe not resistance, maybe more of not thinking outside of the box a little bit and thinking more of their cultural practices within American culture. So that took a little bit of prodding too. And of course, there is the digital tools that there's always a learning curve, but that's just how it is, right? I mean, they all got through it. I did not do any lessons on how to use video editing tools. I gave them resources and they all figured it out on their own. So that was pretty awesome. And then my last reflection was on, how to continue to build out this assignment, this project, so that they take deeper dives into their native and cultural connections. And these are my sources that inspired my project. So that's my presentation. Let me stop sharing. So, should we start with the question?
Yeah, let's just open it up to questions because nobody has typed any questions in. So, whoever would like to ask, please ask. I have a question. So Sandra, you said that you tried to help students establish routines, and you thought that was quite important. Could you just expand on how you help them to sort of
Repeat the last part
establish
of your
these?
question. I lost you
Yeah,
for a moment.
how do you get students? How do you help students to build routines or to establish routines?
Well, one thing that is very important is that for us to show how we ourselves create routines in our teaching. So one thing that I find very important is to have a very simple and clear schedule for students to follow, and to have a routine in the weekly schedule. So for instance, this is what we do on Mondays, and this is what, if a class meets Mondays and Wednesdays, this is what we consistently do on Mondays, and this is what we do on Wednesdays. So, so they have a sense of predictability. I also encourage them to use a planner. I find that to be very, very useful. The program I teach with the SEEK program at Queens College, and we actually provide students with a physical planner that has all the dates of all the events in the program, and also allows students to write down the assignments, homework that they have for the semester. And I always tell them, you have, from each instructor gives you syllabus for their classes, but when you put everything into a planner, you have everything there and you can plan out your week. Another thing that I ask them to do is to have a to-do list and to write it down the night before, so they know what's going to happen, what they need to accomplish the next day. And that's very, very important. And I really break down assignments throughout the syllabus and what's due next. I send them reminders of what's due the following week, and I keep them accountable, and I tell them, let me see if you're keeping up with your calendar and with your planner. They also have, of course, we work in a very close community, and we have students have counselors, tutors, and we're very close with them, so we work as a team, and I think that's very important to support students, to scaffold assignments and to work and to give them that sense of community. Thank you. I have a question for Eric, because I think that we do a lot of things that are similar. I was listening to your presentation, and I see that you like to go from the creative to a more academic assignments. So how do you help them transition from the mentality? Because usually students in my classes are very willing and very excited to write a narrative, to write a poem, but then they kind of get this writer's block, or when they think about themselves as academic writers, they usually express, I hate writing. But then I see that they don't really hate writing. They just don't have, a lot of them don't have a lot of good experiences in academic writing. So how do you help them transition from that mentality of, I really want to write a creative piece, to have that same mentality in writing an essay or a research paper?
I think so by the time I do this assignment in the classroom, we've at least gone over the basics of essay structure. If not in depth, at least we're in the process of doing so right at this point. So they know the academic parts, but one thing that I do is I actually do the assignment along with them, which the first time I did it took a lot of work, but now I kind of have I sort of have my sample already prepared. But that way we go over the process of actually transitioning together. So I read them my experience about music or art that has influenced me and why it matters so much to me. And then together on the board, or now that we're online, I sort of show them the sample together. We go through the process of taking that experience and saying, okay, so what about my experience can fit into the academics? Like, do I have some kind of argument here, or some kind of thing that I can present as an academic paper? So essentially, that process then transitions into a very kind of like fill in the blank, right? It's like, well, if you're going to write an essay, you need a thesis statement. Okay, so what do you want to say about this particular art? So in my instance, we're saying, what should we do when the art we love is created by a monster? So we really just come back to that question, right? Okay, you've thought about how you feel about this person. Okay, let's say a good example, a lot of people pick like Michael Jackson, right? They really like Michael Jackson's music. They grew up with Michael Jackson, but they have mixed feelings about him as a person, right? They don't. So they say, well, actually, now that I know about him and I've thought about it, right? I think that we should listen to other people. There's lots of other music, right? Or some students say, well, I like him a lot, but now he's no longer living, so I'm not really supporting him if I listen to the music. It's just something I enjoy. We should keep listening to it. And then from there we build out, okay, now you've got several pages of creative writing. What stuff in this writing, right, can help support the reasons you think that? So that's kind of the process we go through.
Thank you. I have another question, and I have a question for Karen. So my question is, I spoke a little bit about being vulnerable in front of students, and I think Eric mentioned that too, showing them our own writing processes. I had a class of students, and I asked them to summer last year, and we had a midterm project that required them to perform their poetry. I asked them to write poems, and I asked them to perform one of their poems in a small theater at Queens College. And they were very excited about that assignment. But then when the time came for them to perform, they were sitting there in the audience, and before I was about to ask them to go on stage one by one, but then they said, "Professor, can you please perform a poem yourself?" So I did, and I was very nervous, and I think that was a way to be vulnerable and to show our students what I'm asking. I can do what I'm asking you to do. So in a sense, what I find it very interesting, digital storytelling, and I do something like that as well with performances at the end of the semester. Have you how do you demonstrate, or how do you show your students how to do it? Have you put yourself out there as a digital storyteller as well, or are you thinking about it?
Yeah, actually, one of the ways that I show my students my vulnerability in writing is when we get to the research component, I actually share with them my master's thesis with my advisors writing all over it. And it's always like, it's cringeworthy, right? Because my thesis project was a research / creative project. And so they get to see my book of poetry, and then they get to read the research portion that has all the markings on it. So the academic end, but then the poetry end is they see my writing about being an Asian American woman who I'm fairly frank with them that my graduate work was in bicultural identity of Asian Americans, and I was told there's no space for that right now. Let's look at African American, Latino American bicultural identity before you can look at Asian American identity. And so I share that it is, in many ways, a form of oppression, right? Of the way that I saw my interests in my own learning, and I use that as an example that we can start somewhere that maybe we didn't think that where we didn't want to be, but that we have this transition, this journey of getting to a better place, a greater place.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to address this comment by Sarah in the chat, which asked, or she mentioned, didn't ask, the idea that many institutions require a higher number of finished essays, which doesn't necessarily leave the time for the scaffolding. And I just wanted to say that I acknowledge that about my assignment, actually, and we struggle with this at our college too, is having a certain number of essays the students must complete in the semester, but not much time. And I don't have a perfect solution for that except to try to work with our department and the administration about reducing that number so we can do things like revision and focus more on scaffolding. But the sacrifice I make is that we kind of have some assignments where we move very quickly through them just to get them done. So we can have like a 5 or 6 week project where we write the essay, revise, reflect on it, at least so they get that experience.
I think this is also a good time, like when you think about your final project, to use the backward design to figure out what those assignments are that, you know, the posts that you need to meet for your, you know, for your course and to meet the department's requirements.
And there's a question here for you, Karen. What video editing resources do you provide?
So I use WeVideo, which is a free editing tool. It does have the watermark on the top, but it's good enough. I also think most colleges in their computer labs, or there's usually a designated few computers that have editing software on it. I know we're remote now, but maybe they have a Creative Cloud account that they allow students to use.
Well, my students, when they make movies, and I don't know much about video editing technology, but they use, well, iMovie, maybe you guys are more familiar with it. And they make really great videos with background music. They silence you know, background noise. They create trailers. They do all kinds of interesting things. So, and I think it's free. So.
Yeah, and I think it's good to note that if you are at an institution, all of the Adobe products, even though this is not free, it costs money. But I think as both for students and professors, you can get access to every Adobe product, which includes lots of video editing, for something like, I think it's like $16 a month. So you can kind of sign up for it and use it, and then undo it if you need to. And some of their stuff is so advanced that if you're not really familiar with it, you may not be successful in using it, but a lot of their programs are very useful.
I'm just typing in another great tool that I've just started using is Clipchamp for video editing.
We've gone over time just a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, I will say that if there are any other questions, since we have gone over our time limit, we appreciate that you have joined us today, and thank you for your questions and thank you for your presence.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I think we have to end the session, right? Is there
I guess the idea is that the session will just stays up until the end of the conference in case we wanted to come back to the room. So I guess whenever we're ready to leave, we can just leave. Okay. This was fun.
Yeah, it was. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah.
It was really, really interesting.